In a remote stretch of desert in New Mexico, there are homes that don't have heating systems. No furnace, no radiators, no central air. And yet they stay warm in the winter and cool in the summer. On their own. No switches, no constant adjustments, no monthly dependence on an external system. That sounds unlikely, maybe even exaggerated. But these homes exist, and they've been functioning like this for decades. Now here's where it becomes harder to ignore. Some of them were built for around $10,000. Not luxury homes, not experimental prototypes backed by corporations. Actual livable structures designed to regulate temperature, manage airflow, and reduce reliance on external utilities. Compare that to the modern housing model. In most places today, the cost of a home has less to do with shelter and more to do with systems layered on top of it. Heating systems, cooling systems, ventilation systems, insulation packages, smart thermostats, energy contracts, entire industries built around maintaining a stable indoor climate. And yet, here is a structure that approaches the same problem differently. Not by adding more systems, but by removing the need for them in the first place. So the question isn't just how these homes work. The real question is why they aren't everywhere. Because if a house can regulate its own temperature, it challenges something much bigger than construction. It challenges the assumption that comfort must be continuously powered. And that's where the story begins to shift. It's about more than just a home. Before getting into the mechanics, it helps to understand what these homes actually are. They're called Earthships, a unique name for a unique way of living. At first glance, they don't look like conventional houses. The walls are thick, often rounded, built using materials like packed earth and recycled tires. The front faces the sun, lined with large glass panels. Behind that glass, there's often a narrow indoor greenhouse, plants growing in a space between outside and inside. Nothing about it resembles a typical suburban home, and that's part of the reason most people never seriously consider it. But appearances can be misleading, because underneath that unconventional design is something far more precise. These homes aren't random experiments. They are structured around a specific idea that temperature control doesn't have to come from machines. It can come from physics, from how materials store heat, from how air moves, from how the sun interacts with a space over time. Simple principles used in a deliberate way. And when those principles are aligned correctly, the result is a home that stabilizes itself. No constant input required, which leads to a simple but uncomfortable thought. If a structure can do this on its own, what exactly are all the systems in a modern home compensating for? Is it inefficiency? Is it design limitations? Or is it something else entirely? Because most people don't question it. They adjust the thermostat, they pay the bill, they accept that comfort comes at a recurring cost. But what if that assumption isn't as fixed as it seems? What if it's just the result of a system built around a different set of priorities? And once you start looking at it that way, the existence of these homes becomes harder to ignore. Not because they're perfect, but because they prove something very specific. A different model is possible. And to understand how that model works, you have to go back to where the idea started. To understand how a home can regulate its own climate, you have to go back to a simple question. What if a house didn't need to depend on unstable systems at all? That question led to the work of Michael Reynolds in the 1970s, during a time when energy shortages exposed how fragile modern infrastructure could be. His goal wasn't to make homes look different, it was to make them function differently. Specifically, to design a structure that could maintain a stable indoor temperature, using nothing but its environment. No hidden machinery, no complex technology, just physics. And the core of that system starts with something most buildings try to minimize: mass. In a typical home, walls are designed to be light and insulated. They slow heat transfer, but they don't store much energy. And Earthship does the opposite. Its walls are thick, dense, often made from tires packed tightly with earth. At first, that might sound unusual, but functionally, it turns the entire wall into a thermal battery. During the day, sunlight enters the home and warms the interior surfaces. That heat doesn't disappear. It gets absorbed and stored inside the mass of the walls. Then, as temperatures drop at night, that stored heat is slowly released back into the space. Not all at once, gradually, which smooths out temperature swings. This design ensures stability regardless of the season. Instead of sharp fluctuations, cold nights and hot days, you get stability and constant comfort. A steady internal climate that changes far more slowly than the outside environment. Now combine that with orientation. Most Earthships are designed to face the sun directly, typically toward the south in the northern hemisphere. The front of the structure is lined with large glass panels. This isn't just for light, it's for controlled heat gain. Sunlight enters through the glass, passes into the interior, and warms the thermal mass inside. But here's the key detail. Once that heat is inside, it doesn't escape easily. The thick walls hold it, the insulated structure traps it. Over time, the building begins to regulate itself based on daily solar cycles. It's not generating heat, it's managing it. That's an important distinction, because instead of constantly adding energy to maintain comfort, the building is using what's already available and storing it intelligently. There's another layer to this. Most of the structure is built into the earth itself. The back and side walls are often covered with soil, and a few feet below the surface, the ground maintains a relatively constant temperature year-round, cooler than the air in summer, warmer than the air in winter. By placing the structure in contact with that stable zone, the building gains a natural buffer. The earth acts as natural insulation for the entire structure, not the synthetic kind, but a massive passive stabilizer. So now you have three systems working together. Thermal mass is efficiently storing heat within the building structure. Solar gain is constantly introducing natural energy into the home. Direct earth contact helps in stabilizing even the most extreme temperatures. No moving parts, no external input, just interaction between materials and environment. And then there's airflow. Because temperature isn't just about heat, it's also about movement. Hot air rises. That's a basic principle. Earthships use this to create a passive ventilation loop. At the front of the home, near the ground, there are intake vents or tubes. These draw in cooler air from outside. As the interior warms, hot air rises toward the ceiling and exits through vents positioned higher up, often near the back of the structure. This creates a continuous flow. Cool air in, warm air out. No fans required, no electricity needed, just pressure differences doing the work. And when all of these elements are aligned correctly, the result is surprisingly consistent. Interior temperatures tend to stay within a comfortable range, often between 18 and 24 degrees Celsius, despite large swings outside. Freezing temperatures, extreme heat. The structure absorbs it, delays it, and redistributes it, which leads to a simple realization. If a home can maintain its climate this way, what exactly are you paying for in a conventional home? At this point, the question isn't whether the concept makes sense. It does. The physics is straightforward. The materials are accessible. The design logic is consistent. So the next step is simple. Does it actually work in the real world? Because a system can look perfect on paper and still fail when people try to live inside it. But in this case, the real-world record is difficult to dismiss. In Taos, New Mexico, there's an entire community built around this concept. Dozens of Earthships, occupied, maintained, functioning year-round. Not as experiments, but as homes where people cook, sleep, and live daily life. And most importantly, they rely on them. Through cold winters and intense summer heat, these structures continue to regulate their internal climate with minimal external input. Not perfectly, not identically in every case, but consistently enough to prove something critical. The system holds up under real conditions, and it's not limited to one location. Variations of this design exist in different climates, countries, and contexts. Each one adapts slightly, but still depends on the same core principles: thermal mass, solar orientation, airflow, earth insulation, and the results follow a similar pattern. Lower energy consumption, reduced reliance on external utilities, stable indoor environments. In some cases, energy bills drop close to zero, not because the homes produce massive amounts of power, but because they don't need much to begin with. That's a very different model. Most buildings are designed around constant input. They assume energy will always be available and are built to use it continuously. Earthships take the opposite approach. Reduce the need first, then supply what remains. And when you do that, the entire equation changes. There have been attempts to study and validate these systems more formally. Government agencies have shown interest at different points. Architects and engineers have analyzed the designs. And while not every claim holds up in every condition, the overall conclusion remains consistent. These structures perform, not as a universal solution, but as a viable one. So at this stage, the original question starts to lose its relevance, because asking "does it work" no longer makes sense. The evidence is already there. The better question becomes why this approach isn't more common. Why, if a system can reduce energy dependence, stabilize indoor climate, and function over decades, does it remain on the margins? And this is where the tone of the conversation shifts, because the answer isn't about failure, it's about friction. Not technical friction, system friction. Most modern construction operates within a tightly defined framework: building codes, permitting processes, engineering standards, financing requirements, insurance policies. Each part of the system is designed to reduce risk and standardize outcomes. But those systems are built around assumptions, standard materials, predictable methods, repeatable designs. When something falls outside that framework, even if it works, it becomes harder to process. An Earthship doesn't fit neatly into conventional categories. Its materials are unconventional. Its design doesn't follow typical models. And its performance depends on variables that are harder to measure using standard metrics. And that creates hesitation. For a builder, it introduces uncertainty. For a bank, it complicates valuation. For an insurer, it raises questions about risk. For a regulator, it doesn't match existing templates. So even if the structure performs well in reality, it struggles to move through the system that controls how buildings get approved, financed, and replicated. And that leads to a subtle but important realization. It's not that these homes don't work, it's that they don't fit. They don't align easily with the processes that define modern construction. And when something doesn't align with a system like that, the system doesn't automatically adjust. It slows it down, adds friction, creates barriers that make scaling difficult. Not impossible, but unlikely. Which brings the conversation to its final layer. Because once you understand that the limitation isn't technical, you have to ask a deeper question. What kind of system are these homes trying to exist inside of? By now, the pattern is clear. The design works, the physics holds, the real-world examples exist. So the limitation isn't technical, it's structural. Not in the building, but in the system surrounding it. Because modern housing doesn't operate in isolation. It sits inside a larger network of dependencies. Energy providers, construction supply chains, financing institutions, insurance frameworks, regulatory bodies, each part connected to the others. Each part built around a specific assumption that a home will require continuous input to function, energy to heat and cool it, maintenance systems to keep it stable, ongoing services to support daily living. That core assumption is not accidental. It's the foundation of how the system is designed. Now place an Earthship inside that structure, a home that reduces or removes many of those recurring needs. It doesn't rely on constant heating input. It doesn't demand the same level of energy consumption. It doesn't fit neatly into standardized construction categories. And suddenly, the alignment starts to break, not because the home fails, but because it changes the flow of value. In a conventional model, a home is part of an ongoing cycle. Energy is consumed, services are billed, systems are maintained, there is continuous activity, continuous transaction. But when a structure minimizes those needs, it interrupts that cycle. Less energy required means fewer ongoing costs. Fewer systems mean less maintenance dependency. More self-sufficiency means less external interaction. From a purely functional perspective, that's efficient. But from a systemic perspective, it's disruptive. And systems are not designed to optimize for disruption. They are designed to optimize for compatibility. That's why the friction appears in specific places. Banks struggle to assign value to something that doesn't follow standard cost structures. Appraisers rely on comparable properties, but there are very few direct comparisons. Insurance models depend on known risks tied to conventional materials and methods. Building codes are written around repeatable, standardized construction practices. Each layer isn't rejecting the idea, it's just not built to process it. And when multiple layers behave that way at the same time, the effect compounds. What could be simple becomes complex. What could be accessible becomes difficult. What could scale slows down. This is where the core distinction becomes important. The limitation isn't physics, it's compatibility. The design of the home aligns with natural systems. Sunlight, thermal storage, airflow, ground temperature. But it doesn't fully align with institutional systems. And those systems determine what gets built at scale. Not necessarily what works best, but what integrates best. That doesn't mean Earthships are a perfect solution. They have limitations. They require careful and precise architectural design. They perform differently depending on climate. They demand a level of understanding that standard construction often abstracts away. But none of those limitations explain their position on the margins, because other imperfect systems scale all the time. The difference is alignment. Once you see that, the question shifts again. It's no longer just about Earthships, it becomes broader. How many other solutions exist like this? Technically sound, functionally proven, but structurally incompatible with the systems around them. And how often are those solutions overlooked, not because they fail, but because they don't fit the model that defines what is normal? That's the part that tends to go unnoticed, because from the outside, it looks like absence. If something isn't common, the assumption is that it doesn't work. But sometimes, absence means something else. It means the path from idea to adoption isn't straightforward. It means the system has boundaries, and anything outside those boundaries has to push harder to exist. Which brings the story back to where it started, a home that regulates its own climate, not through constant input, but through design, a structure that uses what's already available, stores it, manages it, and redistributes it over time. It doesn't eliminate the need for all systems, but it reduces dependence. And in doing so, it reveals something simple. Comfort doesn't always have to be powered. Sometimes it can be designed. And when a solution works that way, quietly and consistently, without constant input, it doesn't always spread the way you'd expect. Not because it's hidden, but because it belongs to a different logic, one based on physics, existing inside a system built on something else. And when those two don't fully align, the result isn't failure, it's distance. Some solutions don't disappear because they don't work. They remain distant because they don't belong to the system that decides what scales.